Joining me now, Jeremy Bash, former Chief of Staff to Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, and also at the CIA. Jeremy, you spent years dealing with escalations similar to this in the region. Tragic results on all sides. Let's talk about what the Biden administration can do to ratchet this down. I wanted to play something that Jen Psaki just said at the briefing and ask you to translate her very careful wording into something that we can understand, all of us.
Our calculation at this point is that having those conversations behind the scenes, weighing in with our important strategic partnership we have with Israel, also with other countries in the region, is the most constructive approach we can take. So our approach is through quiet, intensive diplomacy.
So what is likely the quiet, intensive diplomacy? I'm assuming through Egypt, Qatar, there was a call to Saudi Arabia as well this weekend to try to have some leverage with Hamas, as well as the leverage we purportedly would have with Israel.
Well, that's right, Andrea. I think what the Biden administration is doing is exactly right. They're trying to pressure Hamas, which is a terrorist military, and pressure them to stop raining rockets down on Israeli population centers. And by the way, this is a lot different than the war in 2014. In 2014, during that entire war, which lasted about 7 weeks, Hamas fired about 4,000 rockets. In 1 week alone, they've already fired 3,000 rockets at Israel, which, if you just do the math, means that Hamas has amassed more than the ability to go 20,000 rockets against Israeli population centers. And that means that the U.S.-funded Iron Dome missile, rocket, and artillery defense system in Israel could get overwhelmed. And in addition, the quality of the rockets have changed, Andrea, and now these rockets can easily hit 50 miles into Israel, close Ben Gurion Airport, hit communities in Tel Aviv, hit communities in Jerusalem. And so for the United States, I think the priority is to get pressure on Hamas to stop the rocket attacks. Of course, no one wants to see the loss of life, and the heartbreaking images from Gaza are terrible to watch, but we got to make clear in terms of our values, in terms of our morals, that the people who bear the responsibility for this are the Hamas terrorists who put rockets in kindergartens, in hospitals, under civilian places like apartment buildings. And that is the moral outrage that should come from Capitol Hill, from the UN, and from the West.
But let me just also point out, to play devil's advocate here, the Israeli bombing is more or less indiscriminate. If they say that there's a Hamas intelligence office, they take down an entire tower of journalists in their offices. They gave them notice to get out, but then argued against 10-minute extension that the owner of the building was pleading for to try to get the equipment out. So all of their equipment, their transmission abilities, their archives are gone forever.
Yeah, I think, Andrea, there are 3 legs to the Israeli defense stool, if you will. One is their civil defense, their red alert sirens and their bomb shelters. The second is Iron Dome, their missile defense. And both are designed to actually give Israel some decision space before they have to launch offensive operations. But they cannot degrade Hamas's infrastructure just passively, defensively. They have to take targeted strikes against Hamas. And by the way, if they didn't, Hamas would just shoot more rockets at Israel. And so no military in the world, in fact, I was in the Pentagon during the 2012 Gaza war, and military leaders in the U.S. Department of Defense said to me, no country in the world except Israel calls ahead and says, we're going to give you an hour before we strike a terrorist target. We don't do that in the United States. We've never done that. Yet Israel does it precisely because, as I said, Hamas uses human shields.
At the same time, also, what is so concerning about this particular outbreak is that it is throughout Israel proper. So Arab-Israeli is attacking the Jewish-Israeli neighbors, fighting with neighbors in the streets. They really got to be concerned about that, because that is a really proportional difference in this outbreak. It's not confined to the territories.
And Andrea, you're right. I think that's the difference here, which is the intercommunal violence is very disturbing. I've talked to people in Israel, and they say what bothers them even more than the fact that they've got to run into bomb shelters during the rocket attacks is the intercommunal violence. And the question really is what is the prospect for a peaceful settlement between Israel and the Palestinians? Of course, the Palestinian Authority, which is led by Mahmoud Abbas, Israel talks to him. But of course, if the Palestinians were to hold elections in the West Bank today, Hamas would win in the same way they won in 2006 and haven't had an election since. And for those of my friends in the Democratic Party who say, well, if we just got rid of the Bibi Netanyahu government, all would be well, don't forget that Bibi's opposition player, Benny Gantz, he's the defense minister. He's actually in the chain of command. If blue and white, the party of Gantz, were in control, the war would unfold, I think, the exact same way. And unfortunately for Israel, if they were to make a deal with the Palestinians in the West Bank, Hamas would try to tear down that deal because Hamas believes not in a two-state solution. They believe in a one-state solution, and they would continue their terror reign, I think, throughout Israel. So unfortunately, as much as I would like to see an agreement between Israel and Palestinians and Palestine, I don't think that's going to stop Hamas. I think the only thing that's going to stop Hamas is a military campaign, the likes of which Israel is undertaking.
And politically right now, the big winners are Hamas on one side against the Palestinian Authority's weak leadership, and Netanyahu, who was he had run out of a string, and now politically might have another shot at forming a government. Jeremy Bash.
Well, Andrea, I would just say that, again,
Finish
Benny Gantz is his partner in that, so it's not just him who's winning, but I agree with you on that, Andrea.
Thanks to you, Jeremy Bash.